10 minutes after 9 o'clock on Monday morning on KBKW Coffee Talk, 100.5 FM and 1450 AM. And Stephen Arms is our guest this morning. Good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning, Bill. Nice to be here.
Hold on. I didn't push the button right. Okay, now say it again.
Good morning, Bill. Nice to be here.
All right. My apologies for that. You are a... You used to teach history, is what I understand. And
I'm a former history professor.
And where did you teach?
I taught mostly at Fresno City College in, of course, Fresno, California, and I taught for a year or so at my own alma mater, which was California State University, Fresno.
Now, actually, the Fresno City College is different from Fresno State University, then.
Yes,
right? Okay.
CSUF is California State University, Fresno.
Okay. Well,
they're both my alma maters. I have an AA from City College, and then my BA and my MA are from Fresno State.
Oh, okay. And how long have you been here in the Pacific Northwest?
Oh, about 14 years now.
Okay. Was that a retirement thing then, or did you come up here for a different job?
We moved up here actually because we wanted to be, one, we were getting tired of California because California has been kind of slowly sliding downhill the last few years, but also
nothing to do with day after day it's slipping away, though.
Well, not physically, but also the housing market was high, and my wife's parents live there in Washington, so we wanted to be closer to them. So we decided we'd sell the house when the market was high, and we bought a house here, and it's been I ran my own business for a while, and I've done I did my work for Wadsworth Longman when we were still up here, some of it.
Okay,
so.
Now, what do you think about the difference in our weather versus down there? We have a son who's in Hanford. I'm sure you know where that is.
I know Hanford.
Yeah, he serves at the Lemoore Naval Air Station. So when we were down there in July and it was 105 degrees every day, although it was a dry humidity, we noticed the difference from coming back up here where we all have webbed toes.
No, I actually like the weather up here. A lot of people complain about Washington weather, and I would point out to them that Aberdeen in the summertime almost has exactly the same temperatures as Honolulu, Hawaii. I mean, it may not have as pretty palm trees and beaches and whatever, but the temperature here is wonderful.
Well, we don't have the high cost of living of Hawaii either.
Well, that'd be nice. That's the truth also.
All right. So now you are basically retired, or do you dabble in other things?
Well, I do dabble in other things. My wife has her own business. It's called, and I help her out with that. It's called Fiber Play. She dyes yarns and rovings both for commercial and for individuals. She makes basically knitting and fiber art type of things. She has her own business, and I help her out with that. And currently, I'm actually thinking about looking for a part-time job.
Oh, okay. Well, I've got two part-time jobs. This being one of them when Doug goes on vacation, and then I still fill in periodically at Marshall's Garden and Pet, where I worked for 38 years. So
it's a nice establishment.
But I have an opportunity to also take time off, do some traveling, and enjoy my wife, who also retired back a year and a half ago when I did. So.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a nice area, and I like living here in Aberdeen. I mean, despite the fact it may not be a cultural, huge cultural established area. Nothing against it. I mean, but we do have Olympia and Seattle nearby. If you want to, if you like theater and performances.
Well, we have some pretty good performances in our local theater here at the Bishop Center and Driftwood, and then they're starting to bring some shows back into the DNR theater again. So
it is not for a smaller community. Yeah. But I always point out that the college I used to work for had more people than Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Cosmopolis combined.
Oh.
I taught more students a year than Kazi has people.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's because Fresno's 500,000 people these days.
That's big. That's bigger than Tacoma. It's almost as big as Seattle. Really.
It is. It's like I said, a very large city, and it's it's not San Francisco or L.A.
That's an advantage too, I would say.
And I agree with that also.
Okay. Aside from the culture of the harbor, what do you think about our opinions on politics and so forth compared to what you encountered when you were in? Well, I mean, Washington is considered a blue state. In the last election, Grays Harbor kind of split a bit. But
Washington, it reminds me in a lot of ways of Oregon also, and to some extent California. You have areas that are population centers that tend to lean to the left, but I've noticed that the rural areas in this area tend to lean more to the right. For example, I mean, if you in Portland and and Salem in Oregon, for example, are very much, they would be liberal areas. But if you move down to like Grants Pass and into the southern parts, you find it gets more conservative. California is the same way. You have the left coast, as people like to call it. You've got, San Francisco and down to Los Angeles, which is, of course, major population. But if you move into the Central Valley area, the farming community and stuff, they tend to be much more conservative. And I think Washington's a little like that, too.
I see. When I was traveling around down there were a lot of signs complaining about the emphasis that California has placed on trying to get the super mass transit thing going.
Or the rail train?
Yeah, spending money on that and not spending money on like infrastructure for the dams and the water. And of course, they had that dam in Northern California that almost totally failed.
Yeah, the one that almost failed. That was a year and a half ago.
Yeah, and if some preventive monies had been spent on that instead of trying to figure out how to get cars off the road, and I don't know if you'll ever get all the cars off the road. Isn't that a pipe dream, kind of?
I think it is to some extent. I mean, technology may change what cars look like. I mean, I think right now, if you had any severe major advances in battery technology, we may all be end up driving electric cars, which probably would be a good thing in the long run. But I'm a person who's in favor of infrastructure, and I mean, I would really love to be able to get on a train here in Grays Harbor and take it up to visit my daughter in Seattle, or my wife's take a train all the way. I have to get to a major area. I have to get from Aberdeen to either Olympia, and from there I might be able to catch, but there's no straight transit. And I'm a big person for the idea of having mass transit, but you need to run it efficiently. And I have a friend who runs a school in Japan, and of course the Japanese have a very extensive mass transit system, and they have bullet trains there too. But they only have them in certain areas, and they're very narrow in their use because they are potentially dangerous because they move so fast.
Well, yeah, and they had that thing that happened last fall where they were going to have this high-speed train that was going to go from Seattle to Portland, and somebody didn't get all the safety things in place in time, and so it comes around the curve there at DuPont, Washington, and what does it do? It lands on I-5 and blocks that for 3 days.
I had a friend who actually saw it happen. He was driving on the highway about half a mile down from it when the train actually landed on the I-5.
Yeah, and
terrifying.
3 people died in that, and dozens injured. And so
again, which is strange because you think with the technology it would not be that difficult, but that presupposes that the person driving the train actually knows the route too, rather than having the computer do it.
Well, yeah, and I think this was early on for him to be doing that driving, plus the fact that they were rushing to get it done by a certain deadline because of funding issues, and I would think that safety should take priority over we're going to lose our funding.
I would agree. The problem is that the easiest way to get funding is to create a crisis.
Oh.
I mean, it is the truth. I mean, people don't react to good news as an idea of saying, well, we should do something about that good news. No, I mean, you have to have a crisis. And what happens is a crisis gives people money, it gives the government ability to regulate and have power, and it also gives, it creates a business within the crisis itself.
Well, it always seems to me like when they decide to put an overpass at a place that used to have an intersection, like, for instance, in Montesano and Elma and that, they figure, okay, how many people have to die before we decide that they should put one there? And that's just the wrong approach.
It is the wrong approach, but unfortunately, you generally can't get people to move or politicians to do things unless it has to be in their interest sometimes. Uh-huh. And again, that ultimately falls back to us because we're the ones who elect them. We live in a constitutional democracy. If you don't like your politicians, well, guess what? You put them there.
That's true. It is 9:19, and if somebody has a question or a KBKW Coffee Talk, 100.5 FM and 1450 AM. Stephen Arms is our guest. You were telling me that there are some misconceptions of the Constitution that people have, and that's one of the things you used to teach, if I understand correctly.
I also do YouTube videos, and I did one of these recently on talking about some of the misconceptions of history and also the misconceptions of the Constitution, what people believe. And I guess I should plug my YouTube channel at this point.
Well, go right ahead.
It's called, go to YouTube and look for Arena, A-R-E-N-A, Arena of History. And if you see pictures that, if you see a face on there that kind of looks a little like, Santa Claus with white beard, white hair.
Well, you don't have a red suit today.
No, I don't. I didn't wear my red suit today by no means. But I can keep children in line in December just by giving a hard look sometimes.
Oh my!
But there's a lot of things that people don't know about the Constitution of the United States. That, for example, that it's the first law of the land. Well, that's not the case, because the United States existed during the Revolutionary period under what was called the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution doesn't come, of course, until into 1788. I mean, we had and the problem with the Articles, it's interesting, the Articles of Confederation, because it was a one-house system, what they call a unicameral system, and you didn't have a president. You really didn't have a judiciary. That was all handled by the individual colonies or states back then.
Well, they were all trying to be just individual states, or free and independent states. Wasn't that what the Declaration of Independence said? But
the problem with it is you can't tax, because the federal government, if you want to build a road system, how do you build a road system? How do you, if they had to fight a war, they had to request the states give them troops, and they only give them the troops they ask. They could request money from the states if they needed to build ships or to do something, but the states could give them whatever they wanted to. I mean, that's
so it didn't really work then.
No, by no means, it didn't work, and that's what they realized, and that's when they had to shift into something that had a more and the Constitution is an incredibly interesting system, and it's been emulated by governments all over the world,
and also by some states that have come into existence since then.
Exactly. So you have to be, but the point of it is to have a balance in it. You have the executive, of course, and then you have you have the legislative, and then you have the judiciary, and the three balance against each other, because the idea that the president basically is an elected king. I mean, he has the same basic powers that most monarchs have, at least in the time.
Well, for 4 years at a time.
At 4 years at a time. But since of course, when the Constitution was written, they could serve for as many terms as they wanted to. There's no restriction. That didn't happen until the 20th century in the 1950s. But I mean, Washington was the first president, of course, and he served only 2 terms. So it was always a 2-term limit after that, until you got to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because he served for 4, obviously.
Yes. Well, he was elected for 4, and then he died in office on the 4th term.
Right, in the 4th.
And after that was when the constitutional amendment came in.
And after that,
and they did exempt Harry Truman from that, because they said whoever's in office when this is approved is not going to be subject to that. But he only served 2 terms anyway.
He served just 2 terms, and just barely, actually. I mean, though he did win his re-election.
Oh, not according to the New York newspaper in 1948 that said that Dewey had won.
Yeah, they said Dewey won. Yeah, and apparently the media it isn't just the modern media that can totally get lost and confused about that. I mean, obviously, even back then, I thought it was more wishful thinking dealing with it, which was funny, because Truman actually Truman's a good president. But let's see, another misconception. Oh, you've got a call.
We do have a phone call. So, hi, you're on the air with Stephen Arms.
Hey, Steve. So the assumption, or I guess your opinion, that the Articles of Confederation just did not work is I think should be amended to be just your opinion. I believe when they were fixing the articles to take into effect the cessation of sustaining the federal government, there was actually a coup that happened, and the Constitution was written. And I think at some point there was even supposed to be there was discussion that the Constitution should be written every so often to account for the change in time. That hasn't happened either. But the assumption that the Articles of Confederation were not working is just an opinion. I thought they were working just fine. A tad fix to the federal government and taxation, fine, great. We need a common armed forces, sure, not a big deal. But there was a coup that happened, and the Articles or the Constitution has, in my opinion, destroyed what were these United States of America.
Well, that's an interesting point of view. I mean, the question, the articles, the way you said it, I just found it interesting, because you were saying as if you were first person. And I go, then that makes you pretty old. But I was thinking, but the problems with it is that, again, if you don't have some form of central, you would have ended up with 13 individual little nations without the ability to stand against any opposition, because they couldn't raise an army.
That's where they were going to fix the problem. The problem was to create an ability to make a standing army, but instead, that coup happened. I mean, you stated it yourself. There was maybe you didn't say it, but there was a fix that was going to happen at that point to the article, and some of the quote unquote founding fathers chose to coup instead of fix.
Well, coup is an interesting word because it has a definitive military aspect to it. But I'm thinking, when you're looking at the articles here, I mean, you have no executive, so you have, in the event of having to you cannot make any quick decisions. Period. I mean, if you have a crisis situation,
there was a president of Congress during the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, but the powers of the president of Congress were nominal. If you had an invasion in the United States, how would you have responded to it?
Like I said, there was a president of the Congress
who did not have the power to create a standing army. Did not have power to order military directly.
And that's where the fix was coming in. That's what I was saying to begin with. The fix to create.
If you want to say as a fix, the Constitution is a fix of the problem. That they looked at the
weak. It was a compilation and an avoidance of a problem. See, I think what happens is you're talking a very statist type view, and I'm talking a very federalist type view.
I
think the states should be, because 50 individual colonies governing themselves under governors that we do have, under state constitutions that we do have, under all of these good things, and a common goal of an army. Sure, we can come together if New York's attacked and the World Trade Centers are taken down. We can beat up our enemies and all that kind of good stuff. But we have governors for a reason. And that president who is an elected king, as I think I'm quoting you, that's despicable thought process. There's no checks and balance on an elected king.
And I'm sorry, that's not true either. The most successful forms of government in the histories of the world have been monarchies, because the vast majority. The best forms of government have been monarchies, and the worst forms of governments have been monarchies.
I was about to say that. Yeah, no, and tyranny is followed by that best and worst form. I'm just saying, I think that we have a sham of a nation today. I think and the sham is led from that elected so-called POTUS, that king in charge that the whole world hates or loves, or the whole country hates or loves, instead of the people, the people coming together and making the laws, and that guy just finding them.
I'd like to put some opinion on that when I get a chance, but I guess we'll do it after the break.
We are coming up on our break, so we'll talk about that when we get through with the 9:30 news. And that's coming right up here on KBKW with Stephen Arms, our guest, for the next half hour. 9:37.5. This is KBKW Coffee Talk on 100.5 FM and 1450 AM. Stephen Arms is our guest. Shall we pick up with the point that was being made by the last caller before the break?
Well, the idea of states having power, again, this is the big primary part of the Articles of the Confederation. I mean, the power of the state is important, and it's part of the balance and power in the Constitution as we have it, but the problem that the last caller was talking about, individual states having individual sovereignty, okay, what do you use for money?
Yeah, he seemed to think the Articles of Confederation were working, which is not what I was taught in history class.
And it isn't actually the case. If the Articles had been working, obviously they would have just continued them on. They kept running into issues of, again, what is your currency? Do you have a federal-based currency? Does every individual state have its own coins? And again, like I said, then Hawaii might want it to be, puka shells, and New Mexico would want it to be diamonds because they're the only diamond mine in the United States, and obviously California would want it to be gold. I mean, what are you going to do is that? How do you handle interstate trade and interstate relationships? If you have 50 individual little sovereign type states, well then, if California and Oregon want to build a rail system, what happens to Washington, because they need to go through to Canada? Washington says, we're not going to let you do it, or we'll only let you do it if you concede to us in certain ways. I mean, you'd have never had transcontinental railroad. You'd have never actually been able to successfully settle the United States if you hadn't had the ability to have some type of overriding federal government. And the problem with the Articles government is that, the federal government was giving specific powers. They could handle the Indians situation, the Native Americans at the time, that was designated to this government. But the vast power was only in, each state
Which
chose...
was 13 states back then.
It was 13 states, and each state chose, with their own state governments, chose the representatives to the unicameral Congress we're talking about of the Articles. So the point of it is that it wasn't even technically being elected by the people. It was the people were electing people at the states, and the people of the states were choosing people to go to the national government.
And that actually continued for a while in the U.S. Senate, where the legislatures voted on the 2 senators from each state until somewhere around 1916 or so was when there was a constitutional amendment that went through where now the voters in the states decide the senators.
And that's the case. I mean, when you get back in the periods we're talking about, I mean, most people couldn't vote, and there were big issues on people voting. You had to have property.
Yeah.
As a requirement to be able to vote.
And it was mainly men that were not slaves in those days.
Exactly. Well, I mean, slaves weren't allowed to vote, and women weren't allowed to vote, of course, until the into the suffrage movement, in the early part of the 20th century.
Yes.
So I mean, it sounds good. It's one of those things that, when dealing with the states, okay, if states want to take their power, technically they have all power, not specifically in the Constitution, falls to the states and to the people. They can step up and take as much power as they want, but I don't see them volunteering to do it. And I think more is the shame. I mean, we have a Department of Education, and technically there's nothing in the Constitution about educating people. That should be handled by the states. But again, so therefore Washington should handle its own education system. Well, fine, but it seems to want money from the federal government, doesn't it?
Oh, this won't cost us anything because it's going to get federal aid.
And exactly, that's what it comes down to, is again, a rich state and a poor state argument. If the rich states are now, having to sustain the poor states. Yeah. I mean, is that a good idea? If you had if states were individual sovereign type nation ideas working together as a confederation of states, now we're into the Confederacy, which was their idea, because the Constitution of the Confederacy looks a little more like the Articles than it does like the Constitution of the United States.
Uh-huh.
And so, I mean, if you're talking about that, then you have this is the old argument of states' rights versus the federal government. The states technically, according to the Constitution, have the vast majority of the rights. They just don't seem to want to step up and take advantage of it.
Wow. Okay. Other misconceptions that people have.
Well, the one of the ones is that, of course, that you cannot the U.S. cannot become involved in a war or an armed conflict unless you have congressional approval. And of course, that's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, which they generally call the War Powers Clause of the Constitution. The last time it was used was World War II.
Yeah, the war was declared against both Germany and Japan at that time.
Exactly. I mean,
on the day after Pearl Harbor.
Exactly. We had the Korean War. We've had the Vietnam War, of course. Invasion into Grenada. We've had both Gulf Wars, and they've all been done on congressional, without making use of those powers directly. The Congress has approved that the president take actions, but they haven't actually declared war. We haven't declared. We're currently, still killing people in Afghanistan, and we have not ever declared war on Afghanistan.
And sometimes they just get around it by saying it's a conflict, not a war.
That was the argument that the Korean War being a good example of this. It was the United Nations putting forces in to placate the circumstance. It wasn't a war; it was a conflict. And the funny thing is that when the bullets hit people, it looks just like a war to me.
Yes.
I mean, it's just strange that people don't seem to want to understand that. The other issue I always hear that if you look at the Constitution, people say, well, the United States of America is a democracy. Well, I go, no, the United States of America is not a democracy. The United States of America is a constitutional republic. We choose and elect people to govern us.
There's a lot of democracy in the process, but technically it's not in there.
Well, and matter of fact, most of the founding fathers and any reasonable student of history would realize that a true democracy is a horrible thing. Because if the people make all their decisions, do you really want to have everybody go and get on their phones and vote? We would probably have a state religion then, because all you have to have is a majority of the people to agree that we want to have this religion, and guess what? Now we have that religion. A majority of people that don't want to pay taxes, so therefore you have no money.
Oh.
People talk that as a wonderful idea, but they go, well, I don't want taxes. Well, that's fine. But what about issues of civil rights? What about issues of equality of opportunity? I mean, do you want the people making those choices themselves, or is it wiser to have them choose people that have studied the issue? Because most people don't want to spend the time to do it. I wish people did. But I can tell you, it can be, to actually study and follow the events of the day and keep up with it. I spend a decent amount of time reading and studying things just to be able to be an informed opinion on this. And now we have vast amounts of resources at our fingertips.
And then we have Facebook, where you can put an uninformed opinion out there.
No kidding. And Twitter and all these ones. That's a whole other matter of. I actually am not involved in Twitter because I don't think I have enough. I don't think I'm enough of a troll to want to be on that organization.
I do Facebook, but I don't get involved in any of the political things on either side of the spectrum. I won't like something that somebody has said. I just basically, if I'm getting too much negative stuff from them, I will unfollow them without unfriending them. I've done that for a couple people who just seem to be really out there in the fringe.
Well, and then again, in the other mediums, you run into them in massive amounts, and not to mention there are people who actually make a living being trolls.
Oh yeah,
and this is an amazing concept. Let's see. The United States Constitution. This is a misconception that people believe that it explicitly states that there must be a separation of church and state. It doesn't. It does not actually state that.
I think it said that there must not be an establishment of religion.
Exactly. That you should take the time. If you peruse it, you'll find out, of course, in the amendments to the Constitution that you have freedom of religion. The United States the federal government shall create no religion, nor will it interfere with the free practice of it. That's what it states, but the concept of this idea of separation in church of state actually it comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote dealing with an issue of religious freedom in an individual state. I believe New Hampshire at the time, and is in the 1818, if memory serves me, and that's where he used the idea of a separation of the state. But it's not the case. I mean, the Constitution doesn't say that it just says the federal government will not create a religion. It's obviously a reaction to the Church of England, where the British Crown controlled the church and therefore controlled the religion. The United States didn't. That's when a lot of people came to this country for religious freedom.
Absolutely.
But it's not an issue of them of the state being. The part about that I find very fascinating. People always remember the first part of that amendment, the Constitution, that the government shall create no state, but they always forget the second part, or the free practice thereof.
Yeah.
So if a person's religious beliefs, I mean, can you compel Muslims or Jews to eat sausage? I mean that may sound silly, but it is the idea. They have a religious belief particularly against that. Well, then do individuals have the rights, because of their religious faiths, to make certain choices? I mean, can you say, this is the argument the Supreme Court's ruling on this, and it's still coming up again. If you're opposed to gay marriage and you're a person who produces something that can be used in a wedding, can you be compelled to cater or create items for that wedding if you find it morally reprehensible and you're opposed to it directly? I mean, and the simple answer to that should be, well, no, you shouldn't. You shouldn't be. Your religious beliefs say that you have a right. Well, you're being a bigot. I go, no, you have a right to have different choices. I mean, people like the word prejudice. They throw it out all the time, but I think it's in some ways almost an empty word.
Well, we've got a caller on the line. Let's see what they want to contribute to this conversation with Stephen Arms. You're on the air.
Yes. I have a question regarding the Catholic Church with the pedophiles as far as how does the government going to be either part of that, or do they have to stay out and not make any of those people accountable?
No, that's an entirely different matter because you're talking directly about a crime. You know, your religion, your rights in the Constitution are created as long as they don't impinge on the rights directly of others. And if a person if you're committing a crime against children, my personal opinion is there is no punishment that is severe enough for those people. You know, I mean, the guillotine sounds fine to me at that point. But it doesn't change the fact that that's a different matter. That is a direct crime, and that you have no protection. You cannot, again, if your religion says I have a right, your religion says I have a right to sacrifice human beings. Well, guess what? Your religious freedom is now going to be trumped at that point, because obviously you're affecting the rights of others.
Okay, and that. KBKW Coffee Talk at 9 minutes before 10 o'clock on Monday morning, 100.5 FM and 1450 AM. And our listener line, if you have a question for history professor, well, I should say retired history professor Stephen Arms, the phone number is 360-533-5259. That's 533-KBKW. We got about another 8 minutes or so with this segment.
Following up on what we were talking about last time is the argument to be the right to. Does someone have a right to insist upon your labor? Okay, and that's another matter in dealing the difference in the issue of the Catholic Church. You're talking about these are crimes.
Yes,
but do you have a right to compel someone to work for you? I mean, this would be the bakery arguments or the delicatessen arguments of somebody disagreeing for whatever reasons.
Yeah, and also in the Catholic Church, only the men can be priests. The women end up being nuns.
Right.
And that's based on gender, which in many occupations is against the law.
It is, but again, it is the established doctrine of their church, and if I guess it could be fought at a constitutional level. But I think the Supreme Court would probably rule that, as long as everyone's voluntarily doing that, it isn't an issue. But I mean, the idea of compelled labor, because if you compel someone to work for you, then what you've done is then it's a form of slavery. Yes,
that's true.
I mean, you cannot make someone work for you who chooses not to work for you. You always have the option of being able to walk out. Of course, there are, of course, exceptions to every rule. I mean, obviously, a prisoner in prison has different rights than an individual on the streets.
Well, yeah, the constitutional amendment against slavery also said, I think it said involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime.
Yeah, exactly.
So they did make sure that didn't get in there, or we'd have everybody running around the streets.
And it's an interesting point on that also, when people talk about slavery in the Constitution, they said that, well, the Constitution approves slavery, and I go, that's not true. They have generally what's called the 3/5 clause. And the Constitution does mention when you are assigning delegates, meaning members of the House of Representatives, it's based on population. And the South and the North fought tremendously on this, or the free states and the slave states at the time. And the issue was, of course, the slave states wanted all slaves to be counted as part of their representation, even though they weren't allowed to vote or weren't allowed to have any freedom. They wanted the bodies to be counted because it would give him more representatives in the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
So they had to argue and fight back and forth. The interesting twist on the 3/5 clause is people think, it's saying slavery is good. It's the opposite. It established a value that these people are not being counted because they're slaves, because they can't vote, but they are still a person.
Interesting.
It's not that they're not a person. You've established that a slave is a person. Because they're a non-voting individual person who doesn't have their freedom, they count as 3/5. But it still makes them a person, which is in the method of which you're slowly moving to the idea of eventually emancipating your slaves. And of course, at the time when the Constitution was written, most of the European nations and 3/4 of the world had slavery. So I mean, people think that somehow this is just the United States' fault, and it existed all over the world. England lost it 40 years before we did, but but other nations went after we did, and it still exists in the world today.
Well, it's true. Okay.
So the when you're looking at the ideas of it, I'm a big person for individual rights. I think a person, that's one of the reasons I always come in here and I have a copy of the Bill of Rights in front of me. I don't think those individual rights, the federal government didn't grant us our rights. If you read the Declaration of Independence, the idea is that we have these rights. The only reason that the Bill of Rights exists is to remember to tell you that these are things that you have to have, and people need to remember that because it's all about our personal responsibilities. Individuals have to be willing to step up and assert those rights. If you don't, if you're just going to let the government run the way the government runs, you're going to elect whatever suit just happens to come up. And if you're not going to become an informed voter and you're not going to have informed opinions, and congratulations, you're a sheep.
Exactly.
And eventually you're going to be sheared, and eventually you may be slaughtered. You need to choose wisely. You're the one that has the power, not the politicians.
That's a good point to remember. In any election year, this year, of course, is an off-year election, but we do have all of the House of Representatives, and we are having a U.S. Senate race in our state this year, which we do 2 out of the 3 elections.
Right, and a third of the Senate comes up this time also. This election is going to be a fascinating election. If we could talk about that too, because generally midterms elections, about 75% of the time, the power that's in party, this would be the Republican Party at this point, will lose seats in the House and Senate, because that's traditionally three-fourths of the time that's what happens. But it may not happen this time, and that'll be interesting to see what in that case.
Okay, we have a caller weighing in here with Stephen Arms. Hi, you're on the air.
Hi, Professor. Good morning, guys. I wanted to mention the 14th Amendment, probably the most powerful of them all, prevents the states in the exercise of their police powers to tell you to dictate your health, your morals, your safety, and so on. And those were created to keep they were called the Negro Amendments, and they came on after the Civil War. And that was because the states were extorting money from the Negroes as they passed and traveled freely. The 14th Amendment, tell me, Professor, am I right or wrong?
In essence, you are correct. I mean, there were a lot of issues about the whole point after the Civil War was having to deal with the migration of free blacks. And you're right, there were some issues on that directly on the rights of the individual having to be established at the state level. So
if in a case like, those words that they use, sometimes very small, are very powerful if you look them up in the dictionary. And it prevents the state with its police powers from dictating your health, your safety. So, for example, motorcycle helmet laws, out the window. State can't tell you that. Obamacare, state can't tell you that.
That is federal, though, and rather than state.
Well, no. In order to be a state, you have to conform to the federal regulations of what the states can't do. And that's what the Bill of Rights is all about. Am I right or wrong?
You're right. You're right to some extent, but also remember, it is a voluntary union of states. All the states joined the United States voluntarily. They became part of it, and therefore they
move away. But they can't move away from the Constitution.
They have to. They cannot make any law that directly contradicts the Constitution. The Constitution restricts what the federal government would do and sets the.
If you wish to join the quest for knowledge, the battle for truth, please hit the like button, recommend my channel to others, and of course, subscribe. Thank you kindly.